Okay, everyone, it's noon and welcome to Kira's latest webinar in our series, Strengthening Legacy Cities. Normally, Katie Phillips does the introduction here, but she's having a little technical difficulties at home, so I'm going to take over her duties, at least for now. I'm Harvey Miller. I am the Director of the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis here at Ohio State, and I'm very pleased to welcome Alan Mallach today to our series on strengthening legacy cities in Ohio and beyond. Before I get started, I would like to talk about our upcoming event. This is the second in three events this semester this spring on strengthening legacy cities. And on Friday, March 12th at noon, we'll have Charles Marone from strongtowns.org, who will be giving a lecture, a virtual lecture to us on strong towns, a bottom-up revolution to restoring American prosperity. Charles Marone is number 10 on Planetizen's top 100 urbanists of all time. So this is a real opportunity to hear him speak and to interact with him and hear what he has to say about how do we strengthen towns in America and how do we move back towards fiscal and infrastructure and development responsibility towards our cities and communities. So I welcome you to join us. Go to kira.osu.edu for any updates. Also, like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and sign up for our newsletter at kira.osu.edu, and you'll never miss any of these fantastic events we hold on a regular basis. So now I'd like to introduce Alan Mallach. Alan Mallach is nationally known for his work on behalf of stronger, more inclusive cities and greater affordable housing options. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Community Progress in Washington, D.C., and teaches in the Graduate Center on Planning and the Environment at the Pratt Institute in New York City. He has worked at the Brookings Institute and the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. He has spoken at many conferences, lectured widely at colleges and universities, including ours now, all over the United States, Europe, Japan, and Israel. And he's executive director of the Atlantic County Improvement Authority. He's the author of many books, journal articles, and research studies. And most recently, his book is The Divided City, Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America, which looks at urban and neighborhood change in shrinking Rust Belt cities and the uneven effects of urban revival on lower income residents and communities of color. This is part of the reason why he's here today. I read Jason Segretti's review of the book and then read the book and thought, this is a great message we should hear in Ohio. And we're really happy to have Alan join us. He's currently co-authoring a book on neighborhood change, and he's also a concert pianist and author of two well-received books on 19th century Italian opera. You are a Renaissance man, Alan. That's impressive. He holds a BA degree from Yale College and lives in Roosevelt, New Jersey. And with that, Alan, we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Harvey. And let me share my screen so we can get going here. Okay. So, welcome everyone. And I'm here to talk about revival and polarization in the divided city. And it's not just about Ohio, but a lot of it is very much about Ohio. So first, I think I'd like to start with the good news. America's legacy cities, which is a term that's coming into use for older industrial cities in the United States, have changed dramatically in the last, well, let's say 20 years. And whether it's Cincinnati, Columbus, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, whenever you go to these cities, you see amazing signs of revival, amazing redevelopment, investment, activity. And this is driven overwhelmingly by one economic sector, what's known as EDS and MEDS, higher education and healthcare. And what is quite amazing, if you look at Pittsburgh, for example, today there are more jobs in higher education and healthcare than there were in 1967 at the heart of the industrial era in manufacturing in Pittsburgh. And the same is true in Baltimore, Cleveland, not quite, but catching up. These sectors have grown, and today they dominate the economies of these cities. And outfits like Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, University of Pittsburgh and University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in Pittsburgh, Cleveland Clinic, etc., Ohio State, are the economic powerhouses that are fueling the revival of the cities. The second economic powerhouse, which is closely related, is the extent to which the cities are seeing in-migration of what I refer to as young grads, which means young people with BA or higher degrees. And if we look at Pittsburgh, just for one example, the number of people 25 to 34 with a BA or higher degree that live in the city more than doubled from 2000 to 2017, while the city's population continued to decline otherwise, and whole sectors of the city have become areas of concentration of young adults with BA and higher degrees. And that, of course, in turn, has created a whole consumption sector around their interests, whether it's a question of whether it's nightlife, whether it's different food options, whether it's bicycling, whatever, entertainment. All of this has grown as a result of the economic growth and the in-migration of young people into the cities. So this is a spectacular transformation in many respects of these cities. That said, this is also part of these cities' reality. And this is what I really want to focus on, because while the revival is real, and it is not an illusion, and it is sustained, even though I realize there are issues associated with the pandemic that people have raised questions about the future of cities, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the revival is real and very powerful. But the poverty and inequality that persists are equally real and equally powerful, and they exist at three layers: racial, economic, and spatial. So what do I mean by this? Okay, the first point I'd like to make has to do with racial inequality. These cities, our cities, America's cities, are racially very divided, and race, economic condition are totally interwoven and are very tightly spatially defined. So if we look at Baltimore, for example, and we look at the areas that are predominantly white, they're also the areas where they have the highest sales price, and they're also the areas which are seeing the in-migration of the young grads. If we turn around and, a scholar advocate in Baltimore, I think very aptly refers to Baltimore as the white L and the black butterfly. Because if you look at the two lobes of the butterfly, they parallel the concentration of African-American populations, concentration of poverty, and concentration of vacancy. So all of these things are very closely linked. And the revival, when you look at where it's taking place, it's an extraordinarily small area. If we look at Cleveland, for example, there are precisely 4 small areas which account for almost all of the revival: downtown and 3 neighborhoods that basically ring downtown: Ohio City, Tremont, and Detroit Shoreway. Those are also the areas where the young grads are concentrating. If we look at house values, for one example, if you look at almost the entire rest of the city has a weak and depressed housing market and high concentrations of poverty. You have, in other words, this small enclave of prosperity surrounded by poverty. Another thing that's fascinating to me is that even though a lot of these cities are adding jobs, some cases significantly, but the people who hold those jobs are not necessarily the people who live in the city. And in fact, the number of people who live in the city and work in the city is going down. In both Cleveland and Cincinnati, for example, more city residents work in the suburbs than work inside the city. And the number of commuters holding city jobs is steadily going up as the number of city residents is going down. So the economic structure of the city is becoming separated from the people who make up the majority of the people who live in the city. And this is also reflected in racial disparities in income. If we look at a whole bunch of cities in terms of how incomes changed between 2000 and 2017, what we see is in each case, with the exception of Detroit, where nobody's income grew, but in each case otherwise, the incomes of white residents outpaced the growth in household income of Black residents. And in fact, in not one of these cities did the median income of Black residents come up to being enough to match the rate of inflation over the same period. So in other words, they were all falling behind in terms of inflation. Along with this, concentrated poverty areas and segregated concentrated poverty areas are increasing rapidly. This shows Toledo, the number of census tracts that were both high poverty and more than 50% Black in 2000, and then again in 2017. As you can see, in roughly speaking, there were 3 times as many census tracts that met the definition of segregated concentrated poverty areas in 2019 compared to 2000. So again, we're seeing increased polarization. A handful of areas are becoming more affluent, more prosperous, higher property values, greater demand, and so forth. But even more areas are becoming concentrated poverty areas. And along with that, the vacant and abandoned housing is proliferating in these cities. At the same time as we have the revival in some areas, this shows Baltimore, again, 1990, 2000, 2010. You can just see the extent to which the vacant and abandoned housing has spread from a small core to a much larger part of the city. And of course, what happens when you have vacancy more than 20, 30%, ultimately you get to what I've called hypervacancy, where effectively you have no more functioning housing market. Now, one of the things that's really intriguing about this is the question of gentrification. And I suspect a number of you are probably wondering as I'm talking, is what about gentrification? Isn't gentrification running rampant in these cities? Well, let me tell you about one city. This was a few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago. I was approached by people working in community development in Indianapolis who had a question for me. They said, everybody is talking about gentrification in Indianapolis, and yet we're working in the neighborhoods and we're not seeing it. Could you crunch some numbers, do some analyses, and then come to Indianapolis and tell us what you found? Okay, so I agreed to do that, and this is what I found. So first, I came up with a definition of gentrification, and basically that refers to X increase in incomes of the families who live there, plus Y increase in house prices. And I plugged that in. There are about 200 census tracts in Indianapolis, and I found 6 census tracts, and they're shown in the map on the left, that met the criteria of gentrifying. 3%. Okay. And interestingly, they form a ring, a semicircle around downtown, very close to downtown. Then I flipped the equation and I said, okay, how many neighborhoods are declining at the same rate that those 6 neighborhoods are gentrifying? And that's the map on the right. And it was about 60 census tracts, or for every gentrifying census tract, there were 10 that were declining. And they were, as you can see, spread around the city. So this was a pretty telling picture that, and this is true to varying degrees in every Rust Belt city, every older industrial city that I've looked at. There are far more neighborhoods that are declining than neighborhoods that are gentrifying. And yet, and this is an interesting and complicated question, people are talking about gentrification as if it's the dominant form of neighborhood change in these cities, and it's not. And perhaps that's because with gentrification, people can find villains, I don't know, but neighborhood decline seems to be a much more amorphous, hard to pin down, hard to tackle phenomenon. But the fact is, far more neighborhoods are declining than gentrifying. And what's happening is, I'm not talking about the neighborhoods, and we know they exist in virtually every city, that have been in deep distress and high poverty for many, many decades. What I'm talking about is neighborhoods that until relatively recently were viable working class or middle class neighborhoods. And this is St. Louis. The neighborhoods, the dark neighborhoods are basically neighborhoods that were middle income neighborhoods in 2000. By 2015, hardly any of those neighborhoods were still middle income neighborhoods. Now, St. Louis is a very racially segregated city. Historically, the city was divided into North Side and South Side. North Side is this area, South Side is this area, and they're separated by a central corridor which contains downtown, major universities, and to the west, Forest Park, which is one of the most magnificent, if not the most magnificent urban park in the United States. So North Side is almost entirely African American. South Side today is about a quarter African American, but historically, except for a couple of small pockets, was white. So what's happened is that virtually all of the neighborhoods in North Side that were predominantly Black middle-income neighborhoods in 2000 have become high poverty neighborhoods today. The neighborhoods in the South Side, particularly those that are close to downtown and the universities, some of them have declined, but others have gentrified. But not one of the neighborhoods in North Side has gentrified by any reasonable definition. And in fact, if we look at change in these predominantly Black middle-income neighborhoods, what we find is that from 2000 to 2016, household incomes dropped dramatically, the number of homeowners dropped dramatically, and the number of married couples with children dropped even more. So these neighborhoods are in crisis, and that represents a major factor driving the decline of so much of these cities. So this is the picture. Now, that was the picture before the COVID pandemic. So just briefly, I'd like to touch upon, before talking about what perhaps we can do about all of this, I'd like to touch upon the implications of the pandemic for this picture. Because now we don't know all of them, but we're starting to get some idea. Okay, the first thing is that, to put it crudely, we blew it. Almost everything that the United States did in the way of response to the pandemic was predicated on the working assumption that we would have a big impact during the first part of 2020, and that it would basically go away. That's why we had one relief package back in the spring, entirely designed around short-term relief and virtually nothing else. Well, we all know now, because we're still sitting in our houses in February 2021, that that didn't happen. We had a second wave, vastly larger than the first wave. We're still in it. We're starting to get vaccinating, but it's a long, slow slog back to normality. So what that means is we're going to see a lot of changes. The first thing we know, huge numbers of families are in rent arrears. And one of the things that we see is that they're disproportionately lower income, they're disproportionately people of color, and they're disproportionately families with children. This is a crisis that is just waiting to happen. And if it's not addressed, could even further destabilize hundreds of urban neighborhoods beyond their already destabilized condition. Now, one thing we know, ironically enough, despite this, now I must admit, I was one of the people back a year ago, or not quite a year ago, who thought that the pandemic was going to wreak havoc on the US housing market. Like a lot of other people who made the mistake of putting their observations into print. What actually happened is the opposite. As you can see from the graph, even though sales volumes took a short-term hit, by the end of May, they were rebounding dramatically and have continued to go up ever since. Sales prices have gone up. The inventory, the only reason volumes probably haven't been even higher is that the housing inventory has shrunk to the point where there are many parts of this country where there are more prospective buyers than prospective sellers in the market. It is absolutely mind-boggling, but very powerful, and a reflection of a lot of trends that we didn't expect. But it also is a reflection of a very fundamental thing that's going on with the pandemic, which is going to affect our society in ways that are increasingly polarizing, which is what we have is what people have started to call, and I think this is kind of brilliant, not a V-shaped recession, not a U-shaped recession, not a W-shaped recession, but a K-shaped recession, where if you were affluent to begin with, if you had a university degree or a high-paying job to begin with, for you, the recession was a hiccup. If you were not in that category, this is a depression. And one of the ways that this is most visible is when you look at who are teleworking, who have been able to work from home during the pandemic. And it's overwhelmingly people with high-wage jobs and people with high education. And these, of course, are the people who are buying the houses. So we're seeing an exodus of renters from places like San Francisco and New York and Washington, D.C. And those people are all buying houses, either in those same cities in some cases, or in the suburbs, or even further afield, hundreds of miles away in some charming rural village or some affordable small city with a good quality of life. and then telecommuting, working from home. So meanwhile, the people who are stuck, lower income people, people who work in services and retail or did until they lost their jobs, are the people who are suffering, and the people whose neighborhoods and whose communities are greatest at risk. So I think the pandemic has not only undermined the US economy generally, but it has reinforced all of those forces in the US economy that are programmed to create increasing inequality and increasing polarization in our society. So what are we going to do about it? The first thing we're going to have to do is get out of the hole we're in. And one of the things, I must admit, I am cautiously optimistic at this point, because I think the most admirable thing about the relief plan, the so-called American Rescue Plan that the Biden administration and Congress are putting together, is the extent to which it is focused. And this is the first time in a long time, if ever, it is truly focused on lifting up people in poverty, people who have lost their jobs, people who are at the bottom of the economic ladder, and redressing some of the imbalances. And again, I think this is amazing. And I think this means that if it passes and if we roll it out effectively, not only can we get out of the economic hole we're in a reasonable amount of time, but we may be able to do it in a way that will start the process of undoing some of the inequality and polarization that we're currently seeing. So that's a tall order, but I have a glimmer of optimism that that actually could be possible. So given that, where do we go from there? Okay, let me step back. When you look at cities, the most important thing about cities historically in this country, and in most parts of the world, is that they're about opportunity. Cities are where people found opportunity. And in fact, a very sharp urban analyst named Ed Glazer has pointed out that the problem with cities is not large numbers of poor people. Cities are supposed to have poor people. It's about whether the poor people who live in cities have opportunity to become not poor, to prosper, to live a good quality of life. And if a city does that, it's a successful city. If it does not, it is not. And by that standard, we are not a successful city. We do not have successful cities. But I think we can become successful cities if we focus our attention and our resources. And I would suggest those have to be focused in a few key areas. People should have decent jobs. People should have decent neighborhoods to live in, and people should have futures for their children. That's it. If there's anything else, it's secondary. Now, what that means is we have to focus on 4 key strategies. And I truly believe that these are the 4 strategies that we should focus on, and that other stuff should be seen as secondary or even a sideshow. Lifting people out of poverty and eliminating residential insecurity, breaking the cycle of multi-generational poverty, and providing a decent quality of life for all. Now, I want to talk briefly about the residential insecurity issue, because I think that's a particularly important issue. And it's the one area where we need a massive federal commitment to end the epidemic of evictions in low-income communities. Evictions, and this, I mean, thanks to Matt Desmond and his colleagues, this has been put on the national agenda more than ever before, which is wonderful. But I don't think many people appreciate how fundamental this issue is in terms of people's lives as well as neighborhood conditions, is the constant turnover, the constant relocation, homelessness, doubling up, churning, et cetera, these neighborhoods. It destabilizes families. It traumatizes their members. It affects their ability to hold jobs. It undermines their children's education. No child can get a good education if they're changing schools every year or two. And it destabilizes neighborhoods. So this, to me, is a fundamental federal responsibility. Only the federal government can provide a national housing allowance program so that no family has to be evicted, will be evicted because they lack the money to pay the rent for a minimally decent apartment. And this, to me, the fact that we don't do this is really rather scandalous if you think about it. Because you think they're probably the three basic needs people have are food, healthcare, and shelter. We ensure that every low-income family that meets the qualifications can get enough food to eat with the SNAP program. It's not great, but it covers everybody. We ensure that every low-income family that meets the qualifications can get basic health care through Medicaid. Again, it has serious limitations, but it covers everybody who meets the qualifications. But when it comes to housing, we have a program called housing vouchers, which is a lottery. And which means that basically, if you qualify for the program and you try to get the federal assistance so that you can pay the rent, the likelihood that you'll actually get it is about 1 in 5. Because that's all the money that's been appropriated for it. So we need it to become an entitlement similar to SNAP or Medicaid, so that anybody who qualifies gets that. And only the federal government can do that. Now, when it comes back to the rest, one fundamental point I'd like to make, and I'm not going to go into great detail about what kind of job programs, what kind of education programs are needed, because obviously I have some ideas about it, and this may come up in the Q&A. But one issue that keeps coming up when you talk about this stuff is, where are we going to find the money? And to me, that's a red herring. In this country, state governments, local governments somehow manage to find the money when they really want to do stuff. Since the 90s, when they started, the state of Ohio, county of Cuyahoga, and the city of Cleveland have spent over $800 million in public money to build and maintain and upgrade 2 stadiums and an arena in downtown Cleveland. Now, I'm sure that that's provided at least a couple of dozen jobs, but it certainly has not changed the lives of very many people in Cleveland, other than offering them something to root for. The state of New Jersey, under the Christie administration, handed out $1.2 billion in incentives for companies to move sometimes as little as 10 miles from the suburbs of Camden into the city of Camden. No evidence that it's going to create many jobs or many opportunities for the people who live in Camden. It's going to create some nice buildings. If we can spend this kind of money, this is far more than it would take to provide for the kind of training programs, school programs, job programs, neighborhood improvements, and so forth that we need to address the needs of the people. So my final point is that if we are going to address these issues, we need to take a step back. We need to focus on what we can do that is transformative, what we can do that is really going to make a difference to people's lives, not what is going to provide photo ops or groundbreakings. And with that, it's going to take a coalition and a coalescence of a lot of different forces, because this is not just about money, and it's not just about the organizational ability to do this. It's about capacity, it's about power, and it's about political and social will. But I do believe it's possible, and I think this is the critical task, because in the end, a society that is polarized racially, economically, and spatially is not going to be a healthy, a sustainable, or a decent society for the people who make up its members. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alan. Excuse me one moment. Okay, that was a sobering talk. It really was. Let's start with some questions. I mean, there's so many questions I don't know where to start, and we also have some questions the audience will get to. But I guess I would like to know, first of all, why isn't this on people's radar screens regarding legacy cities? I mean, if most of these neighborhoods in legacy cities are declining, particularly Black neighborhoods, and what's all this froth around gentrification? What's all this discussion? What do you think it is?
Well, I think gentrification is a lot more than, if you will, gentrification. And I think in many respects, I think the conversation about gentrification is a way of conveying this polarization, this sense of polarization. Because what's interesting, it's not just about the neighborhoods where you see people moving into and prices going up. It's about something much more fundamental. And a story that a friend of mine told me a couple of years ago is he was teaching a seminar, a graduate seminar at Washington University in St. Louis. And he was talking about gentrification and talking about, population movements and house prices and so forth. And finally, one student, a young Black man, confronted him and said, "Professor, you don't get it. For you, gentrification is about house prices, about household incomes and stuff. For us, it's about powerlessness." And I think that's a fundamental point. And I think that's what the gentrification discourse is about. Because I think people who live in areas that are declining, that are seeing abandonment and poverty and all of this, realize their neighborhoods are not gentrifying. But they also realize they have no power to affect their future. That there's no way, in essence, the power structures, the regimes, whatever you call them, of cities like, whether it's Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, you name it, are disconnected from the mass of people living in declining neighborhoods and struggling communities. And it doesn't matter whether they're the same race or ethnicity, there's a fundamental disconnect. And I think most of the people in the city realize that and are frustrated by it, but feel powerless to affect it. And I think that's what the gentrification conversation is about, as much as it's about specific neighborhoods that are seeing young white kids with college degrees and a lot of money moving in, because those neighborhoods exist, but there are damn few of them.
So what do you think are the factors that led to Black middle income neighborhoods and legacy cities faring so much more worse than the white neighborhoods, especially since the Great Recession.
That's a huge issue. I mean, you've got to start with, whenever we talk about race, you've got to start with the existence of pervasive racism and pervasive racially driven behavior. But in this case, it's linked to how housing markets and mortgages have been working as well. Because the first thing is, Black middle-income neighborhoods have always been somewhat more fragile than white middle-income neighborhoods because of the difficulties Black middle-income families have in holding jobs, in competing, in functioning successfully in a racially discriminatory world. But what really tore it, if you will, was the first thing was subprime lending and then foreclosures, because these areas were targeted and they became the victims of massive subprime lending, massive foreclosures, massive abandonment, starting in 2007, running through 2009, 2010. But one other thing has happened since then, because a lot of white neighborhoods were hit, maybe not as hard, but fairly hard when prices collapsed and have recovered. But since the Great Recession, now Black home buying collapsed from 2006 to 2009, but then it started to come back again, and it's come back very impressively. And you have a lot of Black home buyers in the market today, or have been at least before the pandemic, but they're not buying in those neighborhoods anymore. They're much more inclined to buy in the suburbs and much more inclined to buy in racially mixed neighborhoods. So all of a sudden, these neighborhoods are finding themselves without home buyers. And of course, as we know, because of the racially driven nature of our society, white home buyers don't buy houses in Black neighborhoods. So the upshot is that for the last decade, as houses come on the market, there are no buyers, or hardly any buyers. There are very few home buyers. There may be a few more investors who buy some of the houses, the ones in better shape. A lot of the houses become abandoned. So the upshot is that these neighborhoods have not recovered and continue to decline. They've never gotten over the shock of the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis.
Now, you've talked quite a bit about the Black-white racial divide, and we have a question from the audience here asking about newer immigration, like Hispanic, Asian, more recent Africans. Can you talk about how they're doing in these cities?
Well, it's a mixed bag, because that's a very large group. But there's new immigrants, in many cases, have actually done quite well in some of these older cities. New immigrants and refugees, I would say. And I, in fact, recently finished with a colleague a study of 2 immigrant neighborhoods in Detroit. And one is a neighborhood which is predominantly Bangladeshi. And they have created a very robust immigrant enclave in the heart of Detroit, sort of straddling Detroit and the city of Hamtramck, which is a small city completely surrounded by Detroit, including a shopping street which has well over 100 stores on it catering to Bangladeshi and Yemeni, who's the second group, immigrants. And so a lot of immigrants have found niches in these older cities. There's a whole, in Dayton, for example, there's a whole neighborhood called Old North that has been settled by a group of people known as Ahiska Turks, who were refugees from the former Soviet Union. And again, these enclaves have become very strong neighborhoods. Now, one question is, are they going to survive? Because historically, this kind of follows the pattern of immigrant communities in the late 19th and early 20th century, who, when they came to this country, formed enclaves, whether it was Italian, Jewish, Croatian, or whatever, in these cities. And then ultimately, with very, very few exceptions, those enclaves tended to disintegrate and people suburbanized. So, in talking to people in the Bangladeshi community, I found that quite a few of them are already thinking about, well, maybe I should move to Sterling Heights, which is a suburban community north of Detroit. So there's some fascinating stuff about immigrant communities in these cities. And I think immigrants bring an incredible kind of an intensity of, we're going to make it. That is, again, it's a very much a characteristic of first generation immigrants. It was a characteristic of my parents, and it has a tremendous effect on neighborhoods.
I want to go to a question from the audience now. Someone asked about the declining middle-income neighborhoods you highlighted in Indianapolis and St. Louis, and wants to know, what do you think the degree of this of the middle-income households are leaving this area, and what do you think is the degree that they're just staying in place but slipping economically?
I think it's more the second, and no, I'm sorry, more the first. I mean, obviously, some people are slipping economically, but I've really, it's hard to break these things out with precision, but I've looked at a lot of different data sets to try to suggest, and I don't think there's an indication that the same households are necessarily losing ground. Now, one thing you do see in a lot of these neighborhoods, a lot of the Black middle-income neighborhoods emerged in the 60s and 70s when, the combination of the civil rights movement, white flight, fair housing laws, and so forth, opened up a lot of neighborhoods which up to that point were not accessible to Black families. These were typically the neighborhoods middle-income whites were leaving as part of white flight. And so you had this generation of young African-American home buyers. And for a while they were replenished. But what you're seeing today is those earlier generations of home buyers are disproportionately elderly. So as they, in some cases, pass, in other cases, move elsewhere, and so forth, they're not being replaced. And the younger generation of African-American home buyers are, as I mentioned, not buying in those neighborhoods.
Okay. I want to ask a specific question from the audience, and this question relates to charter schools, excuse me. And I'll just read from this. How do you feel, or do you feel that charter schools paired with community development corporations can be a catalyst for stabilizing declining neighborhoods in legacy cities?
Potentially, yes. I think, interestingly, and when I was working on my book, and my background is predominantly on the sort of the physical planning, geography side of the spectrum. And I felt I needed a crash course in things like education and workforce development and so forth. But I spent a lot of time talking to people, traveling, visiting, and so forth. And I came away with a lot of respect for the achievements of charter schools, especially community development, nonprofit-based charter schools. Not everywhere, but there are some amazing accomplishments. And I think one of the best, I think, which has had an amazing impact on its neighborhood in a positive way, is in a neighborhood in St. Louis called Southwest Gardens. A bunch of parents, this goes back maybe by now, I don't know, 10, 15 years, maybe, a bunch of parents, very racially and economically diverse group, decided they weren't happy with the public school options. And so they got a charter to create a K-8 Montessori charter school in their neighborhood. It's basically run by neighborhood parents, and it's an amazing school. It's won awards as one of the top schools in the state of Missouri. And it has become a major draw. People want to live in that neighborhood now because of Southwest Gardens. We want to live in the school is called City Gardens. And so that's an example where there's a clear relationship between a charter school and neighborhood revitalization. So I think done right, big caveat, done right, a charter school can be a very powerful vehicle, both for stabilizing and strengthening the neighborhood, as well as for helping kids move out of poverty and into opportunity.
Now, during your talk, you also mentioned eviction and the effects of eviction on urban neighborhoods and urban families. And you said that the federal government is the one who really has to solve this problem. But what can state and local governments do in the meantime before the federal government makes this massive investment that you're describing? Columbus in particular has a high eviction rate, much higher than our peer cities. What should we do about that locally?
Well, the short end, it can't fix it, but can ameliorate it to some extent. One of the most fundamental places to start, and a number of cities, including New York and Newark, are already moving in this direction, is to set up programs to ensure that tenants who are evicted have the right to counsel in the eviction proceedings. Because the great majority of landlords have a lawyer when they go into court. Very few tenants do, and very few tenants know their rights, know when they have no alternative, or in some cases do have an alternative. So people have found if tenants have lawyers, in some cases, the eviction itself can be annulled because it was not properly done, or it was not appropriate, or not legal, or so forth. In other cases, at a minimum, they can negotiate additional time or payment plans or something, which may not solve the problem in the long run, but buy time. So that is one thing that can be done at the local level to significantly ameliorate the problem.
Okay, and relate to that, and this is another question from the audience, that in your book, you briefly touch upon the foundations of the power coalition. And we're wondering if you can elaborate on that. I mean, what's the local and national foundations focus on? Policy advocacy, or more tangible, low-hanging fruit such as affordable housing? Or what would you suggest?
Well, I think, first, I think local foundations. And, one of the things that's kind of remarkable about a lot of America's legacy cities is the number and the strength of foundations that they have. Mm-hmm. These are very powerful organizations. I think, to my mind, I think they should focus on, again, to me, it's the big three. Decent jobs, which means workforce development as well as job creation and job targeting. Decent education, which means improving schools and so that kids actually can move out of poverty, and improving neighborhoods by ensuring that they have a decent quality of life. Not every neighborhood is going to revitalize and become wonderful, but every neighborhood can be decent. It can be reasonably safe, it can be reasonably clean, it can be reasonably healthy. I don't think that's too much to ask. And yet, far too many urban neighborhoods don't meet that standard. So to me, those are the big three. And I think foundations have, a role in two respects. First is to support things that clearly directly contribute to one of those three goals. And the second is to use their influence within the local power regime to motivate others. So for example, does OSU, pick an organization at random, how systematic are they in terms of trying to maximize job opportunities for people who live in Columbus, especially people of lower income and people of color? I suspect they have some programs, but I doubt that they are truly intentional about maximizing opportunities, because it's a lot more than having the occasional job fair and the summer program for teenagers. But OSU, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm guessing that every year, thousands of jobs turn over at OSU, just in the normal course of events. If they were truly intentional about maximizing opportunity for those jobs and partnering with workforce training programs and so forth to create a pipeline of people with the skills for those jobs, that could have, just that one thing could have a dramatic effect on the economic conditions of thousands of lower income Columbus residents.
And that relates to a question I had, and I want to ask this as a quick two-part question relating to the eds and meds model, which seems to be the be-all, end-all of some of these legacy cities in terms of chasing them. Why have they become so important, and what opportunities do they provide for equitable revitalization? And then related, here's the second part of the question. I'll just put this in real quickly. That's only the first part. The second part is a lot of this eds and meds model seems to be based upon transfers from state and local government. Is it really financially sustainable as a revitalization model?
Okay. Essentially, very quickly, the eds and meds model, it's a conjunction of two powerful things. First is the explosion in the share of the national income of the national economy that is going particularly into healthcare, but secondarily into higher education over the last 50, 60 years. So that's vastly larger. And the juxtaposition of that with the fact that a lot of legacy cities had, as part of their legacy, major national research-oriented institutions like the Cleveland Clinic, like Johns Hopkins, like University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is the largest employer in the state of Pennsylvania, like OSU, Children's Hospital, and so forth. So these institutions became a focus of that vastly increased national, public and private investment. So it was a fortuitous combination of the two factors that has led to the point where today that sector drives the future of so many of these cities.
And is it sustainable without transfers? Okay.
That's a big question. That's a big question. In fact, the CEO of University of Pittsburgh Medical Center has been known to go around giving speeches in the Philadelphia region saying, hey guys, don't put all your eggs in my basket because I'm not sure it's sustainable. We don't know. I mean, the healthcare sector in the United States is larger as a proportion of GNP than I think any other country in the world by a significant margin. And that is driven overwhelmingly by federal dollars. I mean, Medicaid, Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know how long we can try to sustain that level of expenditure and that level of growth in expenditure. So I think there's a real question there. But for the time being, that is virtually the only game in town for most of our cities.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but I want to ask one last question. I think it's an excellent one. It's from one of the college students in the audience, and said that you've talked a lot about need for change, and the federal government needs to push this. But what can college students do in terms of advocating for change and perhaps in terms of their professional aspirations after college?
Well, I think first, you can certainly advocate as students within your institution, within the community where you live. I mean, you're citizens, you're voters, you should exercise that actively. But I think I would argue that there are tremendous opportunities for meaningful work addressing these issues, whether it's in local government, whether it's in nonprofit organizations, community development corporations, workforce development, charter schools, whatever the particular form your interest takes. And I would urge people, I know local government, for example, is not seen as a desirable career path by an awful lot of young people. And yet can be tremendously rewarding, tremendously frustrating sometimes as well as a veteran of local government, but tremendously rewarding. And ultimately, when it comes to meaningful social change doesn't come from writing blogs or getting a job with Google. Meaningful social change comes from being on the ground where people live.
Fantastic note to end. Thank you, Alan, for a very good talk and great Q&A. And everyone in the audience, I highly recommend this book, The Divided City. You'll find it very illuminating, as I did. And thank you all for joining us today. And join us again on March 12th at noon when we'll hear from Charles Marone from strongtowns.org. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and keep in touch at cura.osu.edu. Thank you all.
Thank you.